Mr. Ski Mask. What a fascinating name to give to a perpetrator. A perpetrator responsible for things like home invasion, abduction, rape, and murder. He has not been captured ever since 1987, and there's a reward that is available of $1.2 million for his arrest, but so far nobody has been able to find him. After all, he was wearing a ski mask. Mr. Cruel, Mr. Ski Mask, whatever you want to call the guy. He was crazy as hell. Now, his crimes were stated as followed. On the 22nd of August 1987, in Lower Plenty, a man broke into a family home at 4 a.m. armed with a knife and a gun. He tied the hands and feet of both parents and locked them in a wardrobe. The son was tied to a bed and the 11-year-old daughter was attacked. He cut the phone lines. On the 27th of December 1988, in Ringwood, he broke into the back door of a house at 5:30 a.m., armed with a knife and a small handgun. He bound and gagged the parents and demanded money. He grabbed the 10-year-old daughter Sharon Wills, put tape over her eyes, a ball gag in her mouth, and abducted her. She was released 18 hours later in the grounds of Bayswater High School. On the 3rd of July 1990, in Canterbury, he broke into a house at 11:30 p.m. and tied and gagged a 13-year-old girl, Nicola Linus. He placed tape over her eyes, disabled the phones, and searched for money. He drove her to another house and molested her for 50 hours before releasing her at a power substation in the suburb of Kew. On the 13th of April 1991, in Templestowe, armed with a knife, he abducted 13-year-old Karmein Chan. Her body, with 3 gunshot wounds to the head, was found a year later. It has been reported that a few detectives had doubts whether this crime was by Mr. Cruel. Detective Chris O'Connor answered a journalist's question in 2013 whether Mr. Cruel was responsible. We just don't know if it was Mr. Cruel who murdered Carmine. We just can't be sure because there isn't enough evidence to make a value judgment about whether it was or wasn't him. That's also what I wanted to talk about for a little bit here because it was a case that brought me to Mr. Cruel, the one of Karmein Chan. Now there wasn't a lot of information to this case, but it's a clear-cut case. It occurred on April 13th, 1991. The girl in question was 13 years old. Now you remember I just said that she was shot 3 times in the head. It's a brutal execution for a little girl. Now at the time she was home babysitting her 2 younger sisters while both her parents worked at their Chinese restaurant in the nearby suburb of Eltham. She and her sisters were confronted by a man in a ski mask with a knife. He forced her sisters into a wardrobe before fleeing with Carmine. Before leaving, he spray-painted "Pay Up Asian Drug Dealer, More and More to Come" on a vehicle in their front yard. Police suspect this was a ruse to distract them from the killer's real motive. Her mother made an emotional plea on television for the daughter's safe return. Sadly, this was not going to happen. Because at the time there had been these several abductions of girls in Melbourne prior to this one, by the offender known in the media as Mr. Cruel. Victoria Police has started scaling down Operation Challenge the day before Carmine's abduction that had been established to investigate 2 abductions in which the victim was raped and an earlier home invasion also involving rape. They believe that Carmine would be released the same as previous girls that were abducted. Again, that didn't happen. On the 6th of May 1991, 23 days after her abduction, Victoria Police formed a Spectrum task force to investigate the abduction and to continue Operation Challenge investigations. At the time, a reward of $100,000 was offered for information on her abduction. Now, on the 9th of April 1992, her remains were found almost a year later in a landfill area at Edgar's Creek in the suburb of Thomastown. The skull had 3 bullet holes in the back of the head, and the body had probably been there for 12 months. On the 31st of January 1994, the Spectrum Task Force was disbanded. Despite their best efforts, the offender was never brought to justice. Now, there was still a reward for anybody that could help identify the person responsible. The reward is $1 million. It was increased on the 25th anniversary of her abduction from $100,000 to $1 million. So anybody with information out there, if you weren't willing to share it, maybe this might finally motivate you enough to do so. Now, what about Mr. Cruel? Let's get back to this man, because the ski mask on the screen that you see there was a supposed sketch of the sort of mask that he was wearing, and it does look kinda creepy in that way, doesn't it? Mr. Cruel is believed to have videotaped or perhaps taken still photographs of his attacks. Detectives believe that if he is still alive, he will have kept the tapes and or photos and will still collect and possibly swap child pornography. They say he almost certainly continues to collect pornography through the internet and may communicate with children using chat lines. He plans his crimes. For example, in one case he abducted a girl and told her he would release her in exactly 50 hours, and indeed he did. He bathed his victims carefully, with one victim describing the act as like a mother washing a baby. In one case, he took a second set of clothes from the girl's home to dress her before she was freed. In another, he dumped the girl dressed in garbage bags so police could not test her original clothes. The modus operandi was the same in the home invasion and abductions, and the three attacks and victims' statements provided confirmation to police it was the same offender. Two of his victims were able to provide police with details of the house where they were kept. Both were shackled to a bed with a rough neck brace. One told detectives she heard planes landing, leading police to believe the house was on one of the flight paths to Melbourne Airport. And they then started to check houses in multiple districts. On the 14th of December 2010, police announced that a new task force had been established about 8 months earlier following substantial new intelligence. The task force has been reviewing both the Spectrum Task Force investigation and some new leads that have come in the last year or so. They have searched 30,000 homes and interviewed 27,000 suspects over the attacks at a cost of $4 million. There is a $300,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Mr. Cruel. They have admitted that some evidence retrieved from the crime scenes at the time has gone missing. One missing item is the tape used to bind one of the victims, which could have provided DNA samples of the perpetrator using new forensic technologies. In April 2016, in the lead up to the 25th anniversary of Karmein's murder, Victoria police released a 1994 dossier nicknamed the Sierra Files to the Herald Sun newspapers, containing intimate details of the case that had previously not been released to the public. The files, which had been prepared with the assistance of the FBI, contained information about 7 possible suspects, including details concerning the prime suspect. It also stated that they had obtained the names of these suspects and also attempted to contact them for information to varying degrees of success. The police subsequently increased the reward for information to $1 million. Now, there have been varying reports by the media of suspected earlier attacks prior to 1987, but the police have never released specific details of the suspected attacks. Detective Stephen Fontana answered a journalist's question in 2001 on the earlier attacks that there just wasn't enough known about him and he didn't want to speculate. And that's kind of makes a lot of sense. Speculating doesn't lead anywhere, but that's what usually happens on Creepy News, I admit. But then again, I'm not a real police officer anyway. I'm not a detective that goes out there, does this for a living, solving crimes. I'm here to share the crimes, get it to a bigger audience, because the mainstream media usually keeps very, very quiet on all of these cases after all. Now, it's kind of disturbing to realize that this man was abducting children, doing God knows what, because that's what sounded kind of weird to me, that he would like dress them up and shit. Okay, do you get what I'm saying? This is so weird. Like, what sort of guy was this exactly, if he's still alive? He must have had some sort of bizarre past himself for wanting to do this. Surely something must have triggered that sort of behavior in his own little mind, and I don't know why, but it's really disturbing in a way to abduct a child and then sexually abuse her for 50 hours straight. Like, what is going on here? But then at least he was nice enough, let's put it like that, to let her go. I mean, it's so absurd. It's so bizarre. I've usually, in other cases where you heard of abduction and then sexual abuse and stuff like that, the perpetrator ends up killing his victims. But this man, with most of the victims that he had, as far as they know, he did allow them to leave, but he made sure that they couldn't see him or his face, so they couldn't identify him. So it's such a bizarre case. It's very traumatizing for these young girls, obviously, what happened to them. But it's also really, really weird who this guy must be. And if they ever figure it out, I don't know. It's really bizarre. Regardless of that, I still wanted to share it with you today through CreepyNews if you haven't heard of Mr. Cruel and his cruel deeds. And sadly, that one young girl of 13 that was brutally executed, because 3 bullets to the head, that doesn't just sound like a murder, but like a complete execution. And then, as the police said, a message that he left about a Chinese drug dealer or something seemed to be a ruse, maybe to lead them off track, but who knows? Who knows? Maybe they did have a grudge against that family of some sorts. But that only the real perpetrator will know. And they have never found him. So if he is responsible for the death of that young girl, he really deserves to be brought to justice. Obviously for the other ones as well, but it's so disturbing always when people get away with child murders. These are the most defenseless ones. So, I hope she's resting in peace. And as always, dear viewer, have sweet dreams.